A mountain man bids on a virgin bride, hoping for a young woman to help him survive the long, cruel winter. But when a 60-year-old stranger knocks on his cabin door, everything he thought he knew about love, faith, and fate turns upside down. Snow whips through the Rockies as he stares at her, frail, shivering, holding a church certificate that bears his name. The preacher made a mistake. Or did he? She's not what he expected, but her calm eyes hold secrets of fire, loss, and something he's forgotten: mercy. While the town laughs at him, she begins to change his cabin and his soul with quiet prayers and a stubborn kindness that refuses to leave. But when the real bride finally arrives, and the truth about the older woman's past is revealed, was this mix-up a cruel joke of men, or the holy work of God himself? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The winter wind moaned through the gaps in the weathered church walls, carrying stinging pellets of snow that rattled against the windows like desperate spirits seeking shelter. Inside, lamplight cast dancing shadows across the gathered faces of frontier folk who had braved the storm for what some were calling entertainment, others a necessary evil: the bride auction. Elijah Holt sat in the last pew, his broad shoulders hunched against the draft that snaked beneath the door. His rough wool coat still carried crystalline remnants of the blizzard outside, slowly melting into dark patches that matched his mood. Around him, the other settlers chatted and laughed, their voices echoing off the bare wooden walls in a way that made his head ache. Preacher Matthews stood at the pulpit, his thin frame nearly lost in his black coat as he raised his hands for silence. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of service to this harsh land. "We gather tonight not for mere commerce, but for Christian charity." A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Elijah noticed how the preacher's mouth tightened at the corners, though his voice remained steady. "These young women have traveled far from the east, seeking new lives in our territory. They are orphans, yes, but they are God's children, and they deserve our respect." The preacher unfolded a sheet of paper, his fingers trembling slightly in the cold. "Each has agreed to this arrangement of their own free will, understanding that they will be placed with respectable men of our community." "Placed," someone called out with a harsh laugh. "That's a gentle way of putting it." Heat rose in Elijah's chest at the mockery. He'd seen enough of the world's cruelty to last several lifetimes, and this situation, necessary though it might be, struck him as another bitter example. These women weren't cattle to be sold, though the system treated them as such. The preacher continued, reading names and brief descriptions, while men in the congregation called out bids. Some were serious, others clearly meant to amuse their neighbors. Elijah half listened, his mind drifting to his cabin high in the hills, where at least the solitude was honest. "Next we have—" The preacher squinted at his paper. "A young lady listed simply as Virgin Bride. No other name given." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "She's described as being of good Christian character and domestic skills." The room erupted in crude jokes and elbowing. Elijah watched as several of the rougher elements in the crowd began making exaggerated bids, turning the whole thing into sport. $10, called Jake Wheeler, a mean-spirited ranch hand known for his quick fists. $12, shouted another voice. $15 and a jug of whiskey. This brought more laughter. Elijah's hand rose almost of its own accord. He wasn't sure what moved him. Perhaps it was the memory of his late wife's gentle teachings about Christian duty, or maybe just the basic human decency his mother had instilled in him long ago. $20, he said, his deep voice cutting through the noise like a knife through butter. The room fell silent, then erupted in fresh laughter, this time directed at him. "Well, if it ain't the bear talker," someone called out. "Reckon even hermits get lonely." "Them mountains finally freeze your brain, Holt?" Elijah kept his eyes fixed on the preacher, ignoring the jibes. He'd long since grown accustomed to being the object of frontier humor. Let them laugh. He knew who he was. Preacher Matthews nodded gravely. $20 from Mr. Holt. Do I hear any other serious bids? He waited, but the room had lost its festive mood. No one wanted to challenge the mountain man, either out of respect for his reputation or simple disinterest. Sold then to Mr. Elijah Holt. The crowd's attention already turned to the next name, but Elijah remained seated, wondering what he'd just done. He hadn't come here intending to participate. He'd only attended because the preacher had personally asked him to consider it, knowing his situation. After the last name was called and the final bid settled, Preacher Matthews began writing out certificates. The crowd thinned as men collected their papers and hurried home ahead of the worsening storm. Elijah waited until nearly everyone had gone before approaching the pulpit. "Mr. Holt?" The preacher's voice was kind, but carried a note of surprise. "I admit I didn't expect you to bid tonight." "Neither did I," Elijah answered honestly. The preacher dipped his pen and carefully filled out the certificate. "You understand the responsibilities you're taking on? This isn't just about providing shelter. These women need protection, guidance, a proper Christian home." Elijah nodded slowly. "I reckon I understand duty well enough, preacher." "Yes, I suppose you do." The older man handed over the certificate, still damp with ink. "She'll arrive with the next stage, weather permitting. God be with you both." Elijah tucked the paper into his coat and stepped out into the howling night. The snow had deepened considerably, drifting against the church steps. His horse, patient as ever, stood where he'd left her, head lowered against the wind. He mounted up and pointed her toward home, letting her pick her way carefully through the gathering storm. The 2-hour ride passed in a blur of white, with only his horse's sure instinct and his own intimate knowledge of the trail keeping them on course. By the time his cabin came into view, the snow was falling so thick he could barely make out the warm glow of the window where he'd left a lamp burning. Inside, the cabin was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire he'd banked before leaving. Elijah shed his snow-covered coat and boots, then added wood to the flames. The certificate fell from his pocket as he moved, landing on the rough-hewn floor like an accusation. He picked it up and sat heavily in his chair by the fire. The preacher's careful handwriting spelled out the bare facts. He, Elijah Holt, was now legally responsible for a nameless woman from the East. A virgin bride, whatever that meant. He reached for his Bible, worn and dog-eared from years of searching its pages for answers. Placing the certificate beside it on the small table, he stared at both items as the wind screamed outside like a choir of lost souls. "Just helping someone survive winter," he muttered to the empty room. "Nothing more to it than that." But even as he said the words, something deeper stirred in his chest. Something he'd thought long buried under 5 years of grief and solitude. He pushed the feeling away, unwilling to examine it too closely. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Elijah sat there long into the night, listening to the storm and wondering what sort of person would arrive on that stage. Would she be frightened? Bitter? Desperate? All three, likely enough. He knew something about desperate choices himself. His gaze drifted to the small shelf where he kept the few precious items that remained from his previous life. Sarah's wedding ring, the tiny baby boots that had never been worn, the daguerreotype of their wedding day. 5 years had softened the sharp edges of grief, but hadn't erased it entirely. Not looking for hope, he told himself firmly. Just doing what's right. But as he finally rose to bank the fire for the night, his eyes lingered on the certificate. Tomorrow he'd need to start preparing the small second room he'd used for storage. There would be other changes too. More supplies to lay in, adjustments to make. The thought was both daunting and, somehow, not entirely unwelcome. Outside, the storm continued its wild song, but inside the cabin something had shifted. Like the first hint of spring buried deep beneath winter snow, a change was coming to this solitary mountain home. Whether Elijah was ready for it, or not. 2 days after the auction, dawn crept over the mountains in shades of slate and iron. The sun, barely a suggestion behind thick clouds, cast weak light across the frozen landscape. Elijah stood in his yard, methodically splitting firewood with practiced swings of his axe. Each strike sent sharp cracks echoing through the stillness of the morning. The routine was familiar, almost meditative. Stack the log, position the blade. Swing, split, add to the pile. He'd done this thousands of times, and the physical labor helped quiet his mind, which had been unusually restless since the auction. The certificate sat untouched on his table inside, a reminder of changes to come. Thunk, split, stack. The sound of his axe striking wood nearly masked the soft knock at first. Elijah paused mid-swing, head cocked to listen. There it came again, a gentle but distinct tapping at his cabin door. He frowned. Few people ventured up to his place, especially in winter. Setting his axe carefully against the chopping block, he brushed wood chips from his shirt and turned toward the cabin. The sight that greeted him at his threshold stopped him short. A small woman stood there, her frame slight but her posture remarkably steady despite the cold. She wore a plain, dark dress and sensible boots, both showing signs of hard travel. Gray hair peeked out from beneath a modest bonnet, and spectacles sat perched on her nose. They fogged immediately in the warmth seeping from his cabin. She clutched a church-issued envelope in gloved hands, holding it like a shield. "Mr. Holt?" Her voice was clear and calm, though touched with weariness. "I do apologize for my late arrival. Our wagon broke an axle on the ridge, and it took some time to arrange alternative transport." Elijah stared, certain there must be some mistake. This woman had to be at least 60 years old. The virgin bride designation from the certificate suddenly seemed like a cruel joke. "There's been some mistake," he stammered, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "The certificate was for—" He stopped, realizing how indelicate any continuation of that sentence would be. The woman, she hadn't given her name yet, carefully opened her envelope and withdrew a document. "I believe you'll find everything in order, Mr. Holt. I'm Sophia Bell, formerly of Kansas Territory." She held out the paper with steady hands. "The document bears your name, does it not?" Snow swirled through the open doorway as Elijah stood frozen in indecision. The proper thing would be to invite her in out of the cold while they sorted this out, but allowing her inside felt like accepting this impossible situation. "Ma'am," he tried again, "there's clearly been some mix-up with the paperwork. You can't be—" He gestured vaguely, unable to find polite words for what he meant. "The bride you bid on?" Her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, showing a hint of understanding humor. "I assure you, Mr. Holt, I harbor no romantic delusions about this arrangement. I simply require shelter for the winter, and you, I understand, required someone to help maintain your household. Perhaps we might discuss this inside? The cold is rather fierce this morning." Elijah shifted uncomfortably, aware of how ungentlemanly he was being, leaving an elderly woman standing in the snow. Whatever confusion had led to this situation, she didn't deserve to freeze while they resolved it. "Clerks and fools," he muttered, stepping aside to let her enter. "The whole system's run by clerks and fools." Sophia Bell stepped into his cabin with surprising grace for someone who'd clearly traveled hard. Her eyes swept the room efficiently, taking in the sparse furnishings, the banked fire, the stack of dishes by the wash basin. Without ceremony, she removed her bonnet and outer layers, hanging them neatly by the door. Before Elijah could protest, she moved to the fireplace and began building up the flames with the skill of someone long accustomed to such tasks. Her movements were purposeful, but unhurried, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. "You have good, dry wood," she commented, arranging the logs carefully. "That's essential for winter comfort." Elijah watched her, still trying to reconcile this calm, elderly woman with the virgin bride certificate. She didn't seem distressed by his obvious dismay at her arrival, nor did she appear to be putting on airs about their situation. There was something quietly capable about her that made him unsure how to proceed. "Mrs. Bell," he began. "Miss," she corrected gently, still tending the fire. "Though at my age the distinction hardly matters. Mr. Holt, I understand this isn't what you expected. It isn't what I expected either, to find myself seeking such an arrangement at my time of life. But here we are, and I suggest we make the best of it until spring at least." The fire crackled to life under her attention, casting welcome warmth through the cabin. She stood carefully, brushing her hands on her skirt. "Now then, might I inquire where you keep your broom? This floor could use attention, and I prefer to make myself useful." Elijah found himself pointing to the corner where the broom stood before he'd fully decided to let her stay. She retrieved it and began sweeping with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown with the fire. The day passed in a strange dance of adjustment. Sophia moved through his space with careful respect for his privacy, but she didn't hesitate to tackle obvious tasks. She found his meager supply of cleaning rags and spent an hour scrubbing the windows until winter light streamed through clear glass. She organized his cluttered shelves without discarding anything, somehow making the same items take up less space. Elijah alternated between splitting wood outside and coming in to check on her, as if she might disappear or transform into someone else when he wasn't looking. But she remained steadfastly herself. This dignified older woman who had apparently been sent to him through some cosmic clerical error. As evening approached, she asked permission to use some of his supplies to prepare a proper meal. He nodded, wondering when he'd lost control of his own household. The soup she made was simple, but far more flavorful than his usual fare. "I'll need to sleep on the floor tonight," she said matter-of-factly as she washed their bowls. "Tomorrow we can discuss arrangements for a more permanent sleeping space, but for now, a corner by the fire will do nicely." "The bedroom," Elijah started to offer, but she shook her head. "Is yours, Mr. Holt. I'm not here to displace you from your own bed. A blanket on the floor suits me fine for now." He wanted to argue, to insist that his mother would roll in her grave if she knew he'd let an elderly woman sleep on his floor. But there was something in Sophia's manner that suggested argument would be futile. She had already laid out her bedroll in the corner, somehow making it look almost proper despite being on rough floorboards. After their evening meal, she sat in his spare chair, withdrew a small Bible from her bag, and read quietly by firelight. Elijah tried to occupy himself with mending harness leather, but his eyes kept straying to this unexpected addition to his household. She seemed completely at ease, as if sleeping on a stranger's floor was a perfectly normal situation for a woman of her years. When she finally settled down for the night, Wrapped in her own thin blanket, Elijah waited until her breathing grew steady with sleep. Then he silently retrieved his warmest quilt and carefully laid it over her small form. She didn't stir, but he thought he saw a slight smile touch her lips in the dying firelight. He lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind and the soft sound of another person breathing in his space. It had been 5 years since he'd shared his home with anyone. He'd thought, when he made that impulsive bid at the auction, that he was simply doing a Christian duty. Now he wondered if perhaps the joke was on him, but looking at the peaceful figure sleeping under his quilt, he couldn't quite say who was laughing. The fire burned low, casting shadows that danced across the cabin's walls. Outside, winter held the world in its grip, but inside, something had changed. His carefully ordered solitude had been disrupted by this strange twist of fate, and he had no idea what tomorrow would bring. Morning light crept through the freshly cleaned windows, casting pale squares across Elijah's rough-hewn table. Steam rose from 2 tin cups of coffee, the liquid black as ink and nearly as thick. Sophia sat with perfect posture on one of his mismatched chairs, her gray hair neat despite having slept on the floor. Elijah stood by the fireplace, one shoulder pressed against the stone mantel, struggling to remember when he'd last shared morning coffee with anyone. The silence stretched between them, like a taut rope. He'd risen at dawn to find her already up, the fire stoked and coffee brewing. Now neither seemed to know quite what to say. Sophia sipped her coffee without complaint, though Elijah knew it was strong enough to float a horseshoe. Her spectacles caught the morning light as she gazed out the window at the snow-covered yard. There was something maddeningly serene about her presence, as if she'd always belonged at his table. "Listen here, Miss Bell." Elijah finally broke the silence, his voice rough from disuse. "I aim to ride into town today, weather permitting. Sort this whole thing out with Reverend Matthews. Can't be more than a clerk's error." "Certainly," Sophia replied, setting her cup down with a gentle click. "Though the passes might still be dangerous after yesterday's storm, perhaps we should wait until conditions improve?" Before he could argue, she rose and began gathering their breakfast dishes. Her movements were efficient but unhurried as she carried them to the wash basin. The familiar domestic sounds of splashing water and clinking crockery filled the cabin. "Ain't right, you doing all that?" Elijah muttered, though he made no move to stop her. "You being, well, your age and all." "Age is rarely a valid excuse for idleness, Mr. Holt." She dried the last cup and set it in the cupboard. "Besides, I find keeping busy helps pass the time." Without missing a beat, she retrieved his broom from its corner and began sweeping the floor. Each stroke was purposeful, gathering dust and pine needles tracked in from his boots. The steady swish-swish of bristles against wood set his teeth on edge. "You don't need to," he started. "The floor needs sweeping," she interrupted calmly. "Whether I stay 1 day or 1 year, dirt is still dirt." Her matter-of-fact tone and quiet efficiency pricked at something in Elijah's chest. The cabin had developed its own rhythm over the years, a bachelor's routine of bare necessities and solitary meals. Her presence disrupted that rhythm, replacing it with something that felt uncomfortably like order. "I need more firewood," he announced abruptly, reaching for his coat. The walls suddenly felt too close, the air too thick with memories of another woman's hands keeping his house. "Mind the ice on the chopping block," Sophia called after him. It looked treacherous earlier. He let the door slam behind him harder than necessary. The morning air bit at his face as he strode to the woodpile, his boots crunching through fresh snow. The familiar weight of the axe helped steady his thoughts as he positioned a log on the block. Through the cabin's window, he could hear Sophia's voice raised in a hymn. The melody drifted out, clear and sweet, neither loud nor showy, but steady as a heartbeat. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Elijah's axe bit deep into the wood with more force than needed. The hymn continued, undisturbed by his violent chopping. By the time he'd split enough logs to fill his arms, sweat dampened his shirt despite the cold, but the singing had stopped. Inside, the cabin smelled of soap and pine. Sophia had somehow transformed his perpetually cluttered table into an organized workspace. His account books stood in a neat stack, and his collection of bent nails had been sorted into a tin can. The day passed in a strange dance of avoidance and awareness. Elijah found excuses to check his storage shed, inspect the chicken coop, and mend gaps in the fence. Anything to keep him out of the cabin. But he couldn't escape the knowledge that someone waited inside, bringing order to his carefully maintained chaos. As evening approached, his stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since morning. The smell of cooking drew him back inside like a reluctant moth to flame. Sophia stood at his cook stove, stirring a pot of cornmeal mush with the same careful attention she'd given everything else that day. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning around. "I found the cornmeal in your pantry. It's not fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs on a cold night." Elijah grunted non-committally and hung his coat by the door. The cabin felt different in the gathering dusk, warmer somehow, despite the dropping temperature outside. The lantern light caught brass buttons he'd forgotten he owned, now polished to a soft shine. They ate in relative silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons against bowls. The mouche was smooth and hot, seasoned with a pinch of salt he didn't remember owning. It tasted better than his usual hasty meals, though he couldn't say why. "Your late wife," Sophia said suddenly, her voice gentle. "Did she enjoy cooking?" Elijah's spoon clattered against his bowl. The question hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. 5 years of carefully not speaking of Sarah, of locking away every memory of her presence in this cabin, and this stranger simply spoke her existence into the air between them. His fingers gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. "Don't." Sophia's face softened with immediate understanding. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holt. That was thoughtless of me." She reached for her well-worn Bible, which had appeared on a corner shelf sometime during the day. "Perhaps we might read together instead. The Psalms are particularly comforting in winter." Before he could object, her clear voice filled the cabin with ancient words. "God sets the lonely in families. He leads out the prisoners with singing." The familiar rhythm of Scripture eased some of the tension from his shoulders, though he wouldn't admit it. Later, after the dishes were washed and put away, Elijah sat in his chair by the fire, pretending to review his ledger. Across the room, Sophia had settled on her floor pallet with his torn work shirt spread across her lap. Her needle flashed in the lantern light as she drew neat stitches across a ragged tear. "You ain't staying long enough to wear it out," he muttered, watching her steady hands repair his clothing. "No point in mending it." Sophia tied off her thread and bit it clean with strong teeth. Her smile, when she looked up at him, held neither challenge nor surrender. "I mend what's before me, Mr. Holt. Tomorrow will mind itself." The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows across the cabin's walls. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its voice carrying across the snow-hushed valley. Elijah turned back to his ledger, but the numbers blurred before his eyes. His gaze kept straying to the small figure seated on the floor, her silver hair glowing in the lamplight as she started on another tear in his shirt. Her presence felt like a splinter under his skin. Not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore. She moved through his space with such quiet assurance, as if mending shirts on a stranger's floor was the most natural thing in the world. The evening stretched on, marked only by the soft scratch of her needle and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Neither spoke again, but the silence had shifted somehow. It felt less like a wall and more like a blanket, settling over them both as the night deepened. Elijah found himself listening to the small domestic sounds she made, the whisper of thread being pulled through fabric, the gentle clink of her thimble against the lamp base when she set it down, the rustle of her skirts as she shifted position. Each sound reminded him that his carefully ordered solitude had been breached, yet he couldn't summon the same irritation he'd felt that morning. When the lamp began to sputter, Sophia carefully folded his now-mended shirt and placed it on the table. "Good night, Mr. Holt," she said quietly, settling onto her pallet. He waited until her breathing grew steady before banking the fire for the night. In the dim light, he could just make out her small form under his quilt. Something about the sight made his chest ache in a way he didn't care to examine. Tomorrow, he told himself firmly, he would ride into town and sort out this mistake. Tomorrow, his cabin would return to its proper state of bachelor solitude. Tomorrow, he would forget the sound of hymns floating through winter air and the sight of mending done by lamplight. But tonight, as he lay in his bed listening to the soft sound of another person breathing, Elijah couldn't quite convince himself that his life would ever be the same. A week passed like water over stones, each day flowing into the next with quiet persistence. The morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight sparkling off fresh snow as Sophia wrapped her worn shawl tightly around her shoulders. She had been keeping track of their dwindling supplies, noting how the flour barrel had grown light. "I'll head to the general store," she announced over breakfast, counting out coins from her small purse. "We're nearly out of flour." Elijah looked up from his coffee, frowning. "Store's a fair walk in this weather." "The exercise will do me good." Sophia adjusted her spectacles with a determined air. "And I saw tracks on the path yesterday. Others have made the journey just fine." He couldn't argue with her logic, though something in him bristled at the thought of her walking alone to town. Still, she had managed to reach his cabin through a blizzard. A clear day should pose no challenge to such stubborn independence. The bell above Whitaker's general store announced Sophia's arrival with a cheerful jingle. The warmth inside carried the mingled scents of coffee, leather, and dried goods. Mrs. Whitaker stood behind the counter, her round face registering surprise as Sophia entered. "Well, if it ain't Mrs. Holt," she said, emphasizing the name with raised eyebrows. Several women browsing the calico stopped to stare. "Miss Bell, if you please," Sophia corrected gently. "I need 5 pounds of flour and some baking soda, if you have it." Mrs. Whitaker's lips twitched. "Settled in nice and cozy up at Holt's place, have you? Must be quite the change from what you expected, getting matched with our mountain hermit." "Mr. Holt has been very kind," Sophia replied, her voice steady as she counted out coins. The exact amount, no more, no less. A younger woman by the pickle barrel whispered something that made her companion giggle. "Gray-haired bride," floated across the store, followed by more snickers. Sophia placed her coins on the counter with careful precision. "Thank you kindly for your help, Mrs. Whitaker. I appreciate your taking time with a new customer." The storekeeper's wife blinked, her smirk faltering in the face of such gentle courtesy. Her hands moved automatically to measure out the flour. Well, you're welcome, I'm sure. Would you like help carrying this?" "No, thank you. I can manage." Sophia gathered her purchases, nodding to the still whispering women as she passed. The bell chimed again as she stepped out into the winter morning, her head held high. Meanwhile, across town, Elijah stood at the post office counter, waiting as the clerk sorted through a stack of fresh mail. The man's weathered hands paused on a thick envelope. "Well, would you look at that?" the clerk said, grinning. Letter from the mission board, Holt. Guess your real bride's coming after all. He chuckled, clearly enjoying the moment. Might want to clear out the old model before the new one arrives, eh? Elijah's jaw tightened. He snatched the letter without comment, shoving it deep into his coat pocket. The clerk's laughter followed him out onto the street. The ride home seemed longer than usual, each hoof beat echoing the clerk's words. Real bride. As if Sophia... He cut the thought off sharply. None of it mattered. This had always been temporary, hadn't it? Just until the mistake got sorted out. The smell of baking greeted him as he approached the cabin. Through the window he could see Sophia moving about the kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she worked. That familiar hymn drifted out to meet him. Be thou my vision. Today, her clear voice rising and falling with the melody. He stood in the doorway longer than necessary, watching her roll out biscuit dough with practiced movements. The letter felt heavy in his pocket, like a stone weighing him down. You're just in time, Sophia said without turning around. These will be ready in a few minutes. She glanced over her shoulder, flour streaking her cheek. Everything all right at the post office? Elijah hung up his coat, the letter still hidden inside. Fine, he managed. The word came out gruffer than he intended. Sophia nodded, returning to her work. She didn't press him for more, and somehow that made it worse. The cabin filled with the smell of fresh biscuits as the sun began to set, painting the snow outside in shades of pink and gold. When supper was ready, they took their places at the table as usual. Steam rose from the bowls of stew she had prepared, biscuits golden brown beside them. But before Elijah could pick up his spoon, Sophia folded her hands and bowed her head. The gesture stopped him short. How long had it been since he'd properly said, Grace? Sarah had always... He pushed the memory away, but found his own hands folding in response, head bending almost of its own accord. Would you like to lead us? Sophia asked quietly. A moment passed, marked only by the tick of the clock and the crackle of the fire. Then Elijah cleared his throat. Lord, he began roughly, the words feeling strange on his tongue. We thank you for this food, and for... He paused, something catching in his chest. For company that doesn't talk much. A soft sound made him look up. Sophia sat with her head still bowed, but he caught the edge of her smile before she could hide it completely. Amen, she said softly, and the words seemed to settle into the corners of the cabin like a blessing. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the clink of spoons and the occasional pop from the fireplace. The letter waited in Elijah's coat pocket, its presence burning in his mind. But each time he thought to mention it, he looked at Sophia, carefully breaking open a steaming biscuit, humming quietly as she stirred her stew, and the words died in his throat. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he would tell her about the letter. Tomorrow he would face whatever changes it might bring. But tonight he would let the peace of shared bread and quiet company linger a little longer. The fire cast dancing shadows on the wall as they finished their meal. Outside, a lone coyote called into the gathering dark, its voice rising wild and lonely over the snow-covered valley. Inside, the cabin held its own kind of warmth, built not just from the hearth, but from something less tangible, something that felt dangerously like home. Sophia rose to clear the dishes, her movements unhurried and sure. Every so often she would pause to adjust her spectacles or tuck a stray strand of silver hair behind her ear. Such small gestures, yet Elijah found himself watching them, memorizing them without meaning to. The letter weighed heavy in his coat pocket, a reminder that this peace was borrowed, temporary. Soon enough, reality would intrude with all its complications. Soon enough, he would have to face the truth of their situation and whatever changes lay ahead. But for now, in this moment, there was only the quiet comfort of a shared meal, the soft sounds of dishes being washed, and the lingering warmth of his first spoken prayer in 5 long years. For now, that would have to be enough. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor as Elijah stoked the hearth fire. Winter's chill still clung to the air despite the warmth within. Sophia stood at the rough-hewn table, her capable hands moving steadily as she folded the week's laundry into neat piles. The clip-clop of hooves drew their attention. Through the window, they saw the post rider approaching, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Elijah stepped outside to meet him, boots crunching in the packed snow. "Afternoon, Holt," the rider called, reaching into his satchel. "Special delivery from Reverend Matthews." He handed over an envelope bearing the distinctive seal of San Gabriel's church. Elijah nodded his thanks, turning the envelope over in his hands as the rider continued his route. The paper felt heavy, official. His stomach knotted as he returned to the cabin's warmth. Sophia kept folding, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Only the slight pause in her hands betrayed that she'd noticed the letter's arrival. The fire popped and crackled as Elijah settled into his chair by the hearth, breaking the seal with rough fingers. The Reverend's careful handwriting filled the page. "Dear Mr. Holt, I write with sincere apologies regarding a matter of great delicacy. It has come to our attention that there was a serious clerical error in the placement of Miss Sophia Bell at your homestead. She was meant to be assigned temporary lodging at the mission station while awaiting transport to Kansas City. The young woman intended as your bride, Miss Rebecca Turner, was delayed in Chicago due to illness. She has now recovered and continues her journey west. We expect her arrival within the month, weather permitting. Please make arrangements to escort Miss Bell to the mission station once the roads are passable. We will, of course, provide compensation for any inconvenience this has caused. With deepest regrets, Reverend Thomas Matthews." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elijah looked up to find Sophia still at her task, methodically folding one of his shirts. Her face remained composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric. "You heard?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. "Yes." The word came soft but steady. She set the folded shirt aside, reaching for another. Elijah shifted in his chair, the letter crackling in his grip. "I can take you to the mission station when the weather breaks. Probably next week, if the pass stays clear." Sophia nodded, her eyes fixed on her work. "That would be kind of you." She adjusted her spectacles with one hand. "I wouldn't want to inconvenience you further." "It's no trouble." The words felt hollow, inadequate. He watched her continue folding, her silver hair catching the firelight. Something about her calm acceptance made his chest ache. The afternoon light faded into evening shadows. Neither spoke as Sophia moved to the stove, ladling out their usual supper of bean stew into tin bowls. The familiar routine felt different now, weighted with unspoken words. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the winter wind moaning around the cabin corners. Elijah found himself watching Sophia's hands as she broke her cornbread into small pieces, remembering how those same hands had mended his shirts, swept his floors, brought order to his chaotic home. After supper, Sophia cleared the dishes with her usual efficiency. Elijah remained at the table, turning the letter over and over in his calloused hands. The church seal caught the lamplight, a reminder of promises and mistakes. Later, as the evening deepened into night, Elijah rose to bank the fire. The sound of soft murmuring drew his attention to the corner where Sophia kept her bedroll. She knelt beside it, head bowed in prayer, her lips moving quietly. He paused, poker in hand, as her whispered words reached him. "Lord, watch over the young woman on her journey. Keep her safe on these winter roads. Guide her steps." She faltered for a moment, then continued, "And grant her joy in her new home." Elijah turned away, something twisting in his gut. Guilt, perhaps, at the relief he'd felt upon first seeing her age that snowy morning, or admiration for her grace in the face of rejection, or confusion at the way her prayers for her replacement stirred emotions he'd thought long buried. He added another log to the fire, watching the flames catch and grow. The heat couldn't touch the cold knot in his chest. Here was the answer he'd claimed to want, confirmation that this arrangement had been a mistake, that she didn't belong here. So why did the thought of her leaving feel like losing something precious? Sophia's prayers continued, barely audible above the fire's crackle. Each whispered word seemed to fill the cabin with a presence larger than their small troubles. Elijah found himself standing still, caught between the warmth of the hearth and the soft voice asking blessings for a stranger. When she finally rose from her prayers, their eyes met briefly across the shadowed room. She offered a small smile, the kind that reached her eyes despite everything. "Good night, Mr. Holt," she said quietly, settling onto her bedroll. "Night," he managed, watching as she removed her spectacles and placed them carefully beside her Bible. The lamp burned low as Elijah sat in his chair, unable to sleep. The letter lay on the table, its message clear and correct, and somehow terribly wrong. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake carrying the weight of time slipping away. In the corner, Sophia's breathing eventually deepened into sleep. Elijah looked at her small form under the quilt he'd given her that first night. She seemed more substantial now, more real than the faceless young bride promised in the letter. He thought of the way she hummed while cooking, how she knew when to speak and when to hold her peace, how she'd brought life back into his dead home without ever making him feel invaded. The fire settled with a soft crash of embers. Elijah rubbed his face, feeling the rough scratch of his beard. Everything was proceeding as it should. The mistake would be corrected, order restored. Yet, sitting there in the midnight quiet, watching snow fall beyond the window and listening to Sophia's peaceful breathing, he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, in putting things right, they were about to make everything wrong. But there was nothing to be done. The letter had come, the truth was known, and soon the roads would clear. Elijah finally rose and made his way to his own bed, his movements careful to avoid waking Sophia. As he lay in the darkness, her earlier prayers echoed in his mind, not bitter words for her own situation, but gentle petitions for another's safety. Sleep was long in coming that night, for both the mountain man who had learned to live alone and the woman who had made his solitude feel empty. The snow continued falling, covering their tracks, blanketing the world in silence, while inside the cabin, two hearts wrestled with the cost of doing what was right. The days melted together like snowflakes on glass. Each morning, Elijah woke to find the drifts higher, the world quieter, and Sophia already up, stoking the fire back to life. The stagecoach hadn't made it through in over a week. The passes were choked with snow deeper than a man's thigh. This morning, Elijah watched from the doorway as Sophia struggled with an armful of kindling. Her breath clouded in the crisp air, her silver hair escaping from beneath her woolen shawl. Without a word, he stepped forward and took the load from her. "Much obliged," she said, flexing her reddened fingers. "Though I reckon I could have managed." "No need." He stacked the wood by the hearth, noting how she'd sorted it by size. Even in this small task, she brought order to his world. "Storm's getting worse. Might need more before nightfall." Sophia nodded, moving to the table where her sewing basket sat. "Then I'd best finish these while there's good light." She held up his leather work gloves, showing the neat stitches she'd added to reinforce the worn places. The sight of those gloves in her careful hands made something shift in Elijah's chest. How long had he made do with the torn leather, too stubborn or too lonely to care about such comforts? They worked through the afternoon, him splitting logs while she darned by the window. The steady rhythm of his axe matched the flash of her needle, two different songs of survival finding harmony in the winter quiet. As evening drew near, Sophia set aside her mending and began preparing their supper. The familiar scent of cornbread and beans filled the cabin, making it feel more like home than it had in years. Elijah found himself lingering by the fire instead of retreating to his usual corner. "Tell me about your trapping days," Sophia said suddenly, stirring the pot. "I've always wondered what draws men to such a solitary life." Elijah settled into his chair, surprised by how easily the memories came. "Started young, barely 16, followed the beaver streams up into the high country, learning from an old French trader named Baptiste." His voice grew warmer as he recalled those days. "First time I set a trap right, that old man danced a jig right there in the creek." Sophia's soft laughter encouraged him. He found himself sharing tales he'd thought forgotten. Close calls with grizzlies, the taste of camp coffee at sunrise, the way moonlight turned fresh snow to silver. She listened intently, asking questions that showed she truly wanted to understand. "Your turn," he said finally, as they sat with empty bowls before them. "What made you choose teaching?" Sophia's eyes grew distant behind her spectacles. "Wasn't so much a choice as a calling. Those orphan girls, they needed more than just letters and numbers. They needed someone to see them as more than charity cases." Her voice held both pride and pain. Every one of them had a story worth telling, worth hearing. "How many did you teach?" Elijah asked, genuinely curious now. "Over the years, hundreds, I suppose. Some stayed only days, others for years. Little Martha was with me longest, 7 years before the fire." She paused, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. She had such a gift for poetry, could recite Longfellow by heart. For the first time since she'd arrived, laughter filled the cabin. Real laughter, not just polite chuckles. Sophia described a Christmas pageant where everything went wrong, from fallen halos to a sheep costume that fell apart mid-performance. Elijah countered with the tale of his first attempt at cooking beaver tail, which had ended with him wearing most of the grease. Their mirth died gradually, leaving behind a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Elijah found himself reaching for his Bible, the leather smooth and familiar in his hands. He turned to Proverbs, the pages crackling softly. "Who can find a virtuous woman?" he read slowly, his finger tracing the words. "For her price is far above rubies. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness." He glanced up to find Sophia listening intently, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The firelight caught the silver in her hair, making it glow like a crown. "Strength and honor are her clothing," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "She shall rejoice in time to come." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither dared to name. Sophia blinked rapidly, turning away to begin clearing the dishes. As she reached for his bowl, her exhaustion finally showed itself. Her knees buckled slightly, and she swayed. Elijah moved without thinking, catching her arm to steady her. Her skin was warm through the fabric of her sleeve, her weight slight against his support. For a moment they stood frozen, connected by more than just his steadying grip. "You should have been a preacher," he said gruffly, helping her right herself. "Way you listen makes a man want to keep talking." Sophia's laugh was soft and a little shaky. "No one would listen to an old woman preacher, Elijah." But there was no bitterness in her voice, only gentle amusement. They finished tidying in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the ease of familiarity. Outside, snow tapped against the window panes like timid visitors. Inside, the realization settled over them both like a warm blanket. The loneliness that had been their constant companion had quietly slipped away when they weren't looking. Elijah added another log to the fire, watching Sophia settle into her chair with her mending. Her needle flashed in the firelight, sure and steady as a compass pointing north. The storm could rage all it wanted now. Here, in this space they'd created together, winter had lost its sting. The evening deepened around them, but neither seemed eager to end it. Sophia hummed softly as she worked, an old hymn about grace and redemption. Elijah found himself humming along, his deep voice harmonizing naturally with hers. The music filled the corners of the cabin where shadows used to lurk, replacing old ghosts with new possibilities. They didn't speak of the letter that still lay on the table, or of the young bride making her way west, or of the temporary nature of their arrangement. Those truths could wait outside with the storm. For now there was warmth and work and the quiet joy of no longer being alone. As the fire settled into coals, Sophia finished the last stitch on his gloves and held them out to him. "Try these now," she said softly. "See if they'll serve." Elijah took them, noting how she'd matched the original stitching so perfectly you could hardly tell they'd been mended. He slipped them on, flexing his fingers in the supple leather. They fit better than when they were new. "Thank you," he said, meaning more than just the gloves. Sophia nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You're welcome," she replied, meaning more than just the thanks. The snow continued its gentle tapping, marking time in its own peaceful way. Tomorrow would bring what it would. But tonight, in this cabin high in the Colorado highlands, two souls who had forgotten how to hope found themselves remembering. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Sophia sat in her wooden chair, working on Elijah's worn coat. Her nimble fingers moved steadily, patching a tear near the collar. The familiar motions of needle and thread brought comfort, even as the cooling air hinted at another storm approaching. Elijah had gone to check on the livestock, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the rhythmic clicking of her bone needle against the heavy fabric. She worked methodically, her glasses perched on the end of her nose, until a particularly stubborn stitch caused her to adjust her grip. As she turned the coat, the sleeve of her dress pulled back slightly. The movement revealed an old scar on her wrist, raised and pink against her pale skin. Her hand trembled at the sight, and the needle slipped from her fingers, clattering to the wooden floor. The sound of boots stomping snow announced Elijah's return. He paused in the doorway, taking in her rigid posture and the fallen needle. Without comment, he retrieved it, placing it gently in her palm. His calloused fingers brushed against her wrist, and she couldn't hide her slight flinch. "Bad memories?" he asked quietly, settling into his chair by the fire. Sophia smoothed the coat across her lap, her fingers tracing the burn scar absently. "Yes," she said after a long moment. "From the mission in Kansas." Elijah added another log to the fire, waiting. He'd learned that Sophia spoke best when given space to find her words. "I ran an orphan mission there, near the border." Her voice was steady, though her hands remained still on the coat. "We had 37 girls that year, taught them reading, writing, practical skills. A small smile touched her lips. They loved poetry most of all. The fire crackled, filling the silence as she gathered her thoughts. Outside, wind whistled through the eaves, carrying the promise of snow. The border raids were getting worse, she continued. We thought we were safe, being a mission house. We were wrong. Her fingers tightened on the fabric. They came at night. Set fire to the dormitory first. Elijah's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, watching her face in the firelight. I got most of the girls out through the back door, the little ones first, then the older girls helping the youngest. The scar seemed to shine in the dim light as she flexed her wrist. Martha, she was different. Special. She'd been with me longest, 7 years. Smart as a whip, kind to her core. She went back in for the account books, said we'd need them to prove the girls' identities. Sophia's voice caught. She took off her glasses, wiping them with trembling hands. I tried to follow her. That's how I got this. She touched the scar. A burning beam. I couldn't reach her. The roof started coming down. The wind outside grew stronger, its moan like a distant cry. Elijah shifted in his chair, his own memories of loss casting shadows across his face. I searched for weeks after. Some of the girls found homes with local families. Others went to different missions. But Martha... Sophia put her glasses back on, blinking hard. No one ever found her. No body in the ruins. No word of her with other survivors. Just... gone. She picked up the needle again, though her hands still shook. I've been searching ever since, following every lead, every rumor of a girl matching her description. 5 years now. The thread slipped through the eye of the needle, gleaming in the firelight. She'd be 19 now, old enough to make her own way, perhaps. But I promised those girls a home, you see. A family. I failed them. Failed her. Elijah watched her resume her mending, each stitch precise despite her trembling fingers. The quiet strength in her movements stirred something in him, recognition, perhaps, of a grief as deep as his own. You saved them, he said finally, his voice rough. The ones you could. Sophia's needle paused. Yes, she whispered, but it's the ones we couldn't save that haunt us, isn't it? Their eyes met across the fire-lit space, understanding flowing between them like a current. They both knew the weight of such ghosts. The evening deepened into night. Sophia finished mending the coat, her stitches invisible in the worn fabric. They shared a simple supper of bread and stew, the silence between them comfortable now, held together by shared pain and quiet respect. That night, Elijah's dreams were filled with fire. He saw his wife's fever-bright eyes merge with visions of burning buildings, heard infant cries blend with girls' screams. He woke before dawn, sweat cold on his skin despite the banked fire. Through the window, he could see the first hint of gray light touching the eastern sky. The storm had passed in the night, leaving fresh snow like a clean page waiting to be written upon. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake Sophia where she slept in her corner. Outside, the air was crisp and clear, his breath forming clouds in the still morning. He gathered his tools from the lean-to, saw, hammer, nails he'd been saving for fence repair. The work went quickly. He chose 2 straight pieces of pine, still fragrant with sap. The cross took shape under his hands, simple but solid. He set it firmly in the ground near the cabin's eastern corner, where the morning sun would touch it first. He was tamping down the last of the earth when he heard the cabin door open. Sophia stood there, wrapped in her shawl, watching him with questioning eyes. For the ones you couldn't save, he murmured, stepping back from his work. Yours and mine both. Sophia's hand went to her throat, her eyes bright with tears. She disappeared briefly into the cabin, returning with something clutched in her hand. As Elijah watched, she knelt in the snow beside the cross. From her pocket, she drew out a small wildflower, one of the hardy winter blooms she'd been pressing between Bible pages. She placed it gently at the base of the cross, her fingers lingering on the rough wood. Without words, Elijah knelt beside her in the snow. Together they bowed their heads, letting the rising sun warm their faces. The mountain wind moved softly around them, no longer a howl of loss, but a gentle whisper of prayer. In the distance, a meadowlark began to sing, its clear notes rising like hope in the morning air. They remained there until the sun cleared the eastern ridge, casting long shadows behind them. The cross stood straight and true against the backdrop of snow-covered peaks, a marker not just of loss, but of understanding shared, of burdens carried together instead of alone. When they finally rose, the snow had soaked through their clothes, but neither seemed to notice. Sophia's hand found Elijah's arm, squeezing gently in gratitude too deep for words. He covered her small hand with his larger one for a moment, acknowledging what had passed between them. Without speaking, they turned back to the cabin, where breakfast needed making and the day's work waited. But something had shifted, as surely as the turning of the earth beneath the snow. Their griefs, finally spoken, had somehow made room for something new to grow. The wildflower lay bright against the white snow, a single spot of color in a world of white and shadow. Like hope itself, small but stubbornly alive, waiting for spring. The January morning dawned clear and sharp as a knife's edge. Elijah breathed in the crisp air, his boots crunching through the crusted snow as he made his way to the barn. The storm that had held them hostage for weeks had finally broken, leaving behind a world polished bright as new silver. He saddled his horse with practiced movements, though his mind wandered back to the cabin where Sophia would be starting breakfast. The routine they'd fallen into felt as natural as breathing now. Her quiet presence, the smell of coffee greeting him when he came in from morning chores, the way she seemed to know when to speak, and when to let silence do its work. The ride into town took longer than usual. Deep drifts forced him to pick his way carefully along the trail, the horse snorting clouds of steam in the cold. By the time he reached San Gabriel's crossing, the sun had climbed high enough to start melting the snow in patches, making the street muddy and treacherous. Outside the general store, several wagons stood testament to others taking advantage of the break in weather. Elijah tied his horse to the hitching post, stamping his feet to warm them before heading inside. The bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed at odds with his mood. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man himself." Tom Wheeler, the storekeeper, called out from behind the counter. "Thought maybe the wolves had got you during that last blow?" "Takes more than wolves," Elijah muttered, pulling his list from his coat pocket. Sophia's neat handwriting detailed their needs: flour, coffee, sugar, salt pork. He'd added lamp oil and rifle cartridges in his own rough scrawl. As Tom gathered the supplies, the store filled with the usual mix of ranchers and townspeople. Elijah kept to himself, checking items off the list until he heard mention of the stage line. "Finally getting through from Denver tomorrow," a woman was saying. "First run since before Christmas." Elijah's hand stilled on the paper. Tom, stacking cans on the counter, nodded in agreement. "About time, too. Got passengers waiting at both ends, including some church folk headed this way." He glanced at Elijah with poorly concealed interest. "Hear tell there might be a bride or two in the bunch." The weight of those words settled heavy in Elijah's chest. He'd known this day was coming, had tried to prepare himself for it, but the reality struck him harder than expected. The thought of replacing Sophia's steady presence with a stranger's made his throat tight. "Just wrap it up," he said gruffly, pushing the list across the counter. While Tom worked, Elijah stared out the window at the brightening sky, remembering how Sophia had predicted the storm's breaking by watching the clouds the day before. The ride home seemed longer still, his horse's hooves marking time like a funeral drum. The cabin came into view just as the sun passed its peak, smoke rising straight from the chimney, windows glowing with warmth. For a moment he sat in the saddle, trying to fix the image in his memory. Sophia met him at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. "The beans are hot," she said, helping him with the packages, "and I've got cornbread in the oven." He stood in the doorway, snow melting from his boots, watching her move about the cabin with familiar ease. The words stuck in his throat, but they had to be said. "Stage is coming through tomorrow," he managed finally. "From Denver." Sophia's hands stilled on the package she was unwrapping. "Ah," she said softly. "I see." She set the paper-wrapped bundle on the table with careful precision. "Well then, I'll make sure to leave everything in good order. Fresh linens on the bed, and I've just made soap that should last a while." "Sophia," he started, but she shook her head. "No need to explain, Elijah. We both knew this was temporary." Her smile was gentle but didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll pack my things tonight. Best to make an early start tomorrow, before the stage arrives." The rest of the day passed in a strange, strained quiet. They went about their usual tasks, Elijah tending to the stock, Sophia keeping the home fires burning. But every action felt weighted with finality. At supper they barely spoke, though the beans were perfectly seasoned and the cornbread golden brown. As darkness fell, Elijah took his pipe out to the porch, unable to bear watching Sophia pack her meager belongings into the carpet bag she'd arrived with. The night was clear and cold, stars pricking holes in the black velvet sky. He scraped a match against the porch post, the brief flare illuminating his weathered hands. Inside, he could hear Sophia moving about, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. Once, he caught the sound of what might have been a stifled sob, but when he turned his head to listen, there was only silence. The pipe tobacco burned down to ash as he sat there, trying to make sense of the ache in his chest. He'd lived alone for 5 years after losing Sarah and the baby, had thought himself content in his solitude. Now the prospect of returning to that emptiness felt like a physical weight pressing against his ribs. Through the cabin's window, he could see Sophia's shadow as she knelt by her bedroll, head bowed in prayer. The sight stirred something in him, admiration for her quiet strength, respect for her unwavering faith, and something else he wasn't ready to name. The night deepened. Elijah's pipe went cold. Still he sat, listening to the wind in the pines and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. The moon traced its arc across the sky, painting silver patterns on the snow. Inside, Sophia's candle burned late into the night. He wondered what she prayed for, whether she asked for guidance or comfort, or both. His own prayers had grown rusty with disuse, but tonight they rose unbidden, wordless questions that had no answers. Dawn came too soon, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Elijah had barely slept, but he rose before first light to saddle the mule for Sophia's journey. Each step felt heavy as he worked, checking the cinch, securing her carpet bag to the saddle. When he returned to the cabin, Sophia stood ready in her best dress, faded but clean, her gray hair neat under her bonnet. She'd left breakfast on the table, coffee still steaming, biscuits wrapped in a cloth to keep warm. "You didn't have to," he began. "I wanted to," she said simply. "One last meal together." They ate in silence, the coffee too hot to drink quickly, the biscuits crumbling under their fingers. Through the window, they could see the sky brightening, marking the minutes slipping away. Finally, Sophia stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "Well," she said, her voice steady despite the brightness in her eyes. "I believe everything's in order. The larder's organized and there's soup stock in the cold box for—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "For when it's needed." Elijah nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He helped her with her shawl, his fingers clumsy with things he couldn't say. Together they stepped out into the crisp morning air, their breath forming clouds in the stillness. The mule stood patiently, steam rising from its flanks in the cold. Sophia patted its neck before allowing Elijah to help her mount. She settled herself sideways in the saddle, arranging her skirts with dignity. "The mission station in Silver Creek should be able to help me find a place," she said, more to fill the silence than anything else. "I hear they're always in need of teachers." Elijah stood with his hand on the mule's bridle, searching for words that made sense of what he was losing. The sun was rising properly now, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Sophia's face caught the light, showing every line earned through years of service and sacrifice, beautiful in its own way as the dawn. Words failed him, as they so often did. He reached up and adjusted her shawl instead, making sure it was secure against the morning chill. Her hand caught his briefly, warm despite the cold. "Thank you, Elijah," she said softly, "for everything." He nodded, stepped back, and took up the mule's lead rope. The first step toward town felt like stepping off a cliff, but he made himself move forward. Behind them, smoke still rose from the cabin's chimney, carrying with it the scent of coffee and the memory of less lonely days. The morning light strengthened as they made their way down the trail, neither speaking, both lost in thoughts of what had been and what might have been. Ahead lay town, the stage from Denver, and the end of something neither of them had expected to find in the winter of their lives. The sun climbed higher, their shadows stretching long across the snow, growing shorter with each step toward separation. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing, its clear notes carrying across the frozen landscape like a prayer. Morning sunlight glinted off fresh snow as Elijah guided the horses pulling his wooden sled through the streets of San Gabriel's Crossing. The runners whispered against packed snow, the only sound besides the jingle of harness and the soft breathing of the horses. Beside him, Sophia sat straight-backed and composed, though her gloved hands were clasped tightly in her lap. The town stirred to life around them. Shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, smoke curled from chimneys, and here and there, townsfolk paused to watch them pass. Elijah felt their curious stares but kept his eyes forward, conscious of Sophia's quiet dignity beside him. "Quite a crowd gathering," he muttered, noting the number of people drifting toward the stage depot. Word of the arriving bride must have spread. "People enjoy a spectacle," Sophia replied softly. Her voice held no bitterness, only a trace of resignation. "Though I suppose I've given them plenty to gossip about these past weeks." Elijah's hands tightened on the reins. "You've done nothing to be ashamed of." "No," she agreed, "but I've learned that people will talk regardless." She adjusted her shawl against the morning chill. "The important thing is that your real bride arrives safely. That's what we should focus on today." The depot came into view, its weathered boards and tin roof gleaming with frost. A small crowd had indeed gathered, stamping their feet and rubbing their hands in the cold. Elijah guided the sled to one side, finding a spot where they could wait without being too conspicuous. He helped Sophia down, noting how light she felt, how fragile despite her straight spine and lifted chin. She brushed snow from her skirts and squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever came next with grace. The waiting stretched. Sophia stood quietly, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Once, she dropped one of her gloves, and Elijah stooped quickly to retrieve it. Their fingers brushed as he returned it, and he felt her hand tremble slightly before she drew away. A distant sound caught their attention, the rhythmic drumming of hooves and the creak of wheels. The crowd stirred, conversation rising as the stagecoach appeared around the bend in the road. Steam rose from the horses' flanks as they trotted the final stretch, their harness jingling with each step. The coach itself was impressive, a Concord model painted red and black, now dusty from travel. It swayed on its leather thoroughbraces as it drew to a halt, wheels grinding against packed snow. The driver set the brake with a sharp crack that made several onlookers jump. Steam hissed from the horses' nostrils as they stood, sides heaving. The coach door remained closed for a long moment while the driver climbed down to open it. Elijah found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't have said why. The door creaked open. A young woman appeared in the opening, hesitating before taking the driver's offered hand. She stepped down carefully, her dark traveling dress brushing the snow. She was young, no more than 19, with a pale, frightened face beneath her bonnet. Beside Elijah, Sophia made a strange, choked sound. Her gloves fell unheeded to the snow as both hands flew to her mouth. She swayed slightly, and Elijah steadied her with a concerned hand on her elbow. "Sophia?" he asked quietly. "Are you all right?" But Sophia's eyes were fixed on the young woman, who had now turned to survey the crowd. The girl's gaze swept past them, then snapped back. Her eyes widened in recognition, and all the color drained from her face. "Mother Sophia?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd, they carried clearly. Sophia took one stumbling step forward. "Martha." Her voice broke on the name. "Martha, is it really you?" The girl, Martha, stood frozen for a moment longer. Then, with a cry that seemed torn from her very soul, she ran forward. Sophia met her halfway, and they collided in an embrace that was half laughter, half sobbing. They clung to each other as if afraid the other might disappear, tears streaming down both their faces. The townsfolk watched in amazed silence as the scene unfolded before them. Elijah himself felt rooted to the spot, struck by the raw emotion and the sense that he was witnessing something profound and holy. "They said you were dead," Sophia was saying, her words muffled against Martha's hair. "The mission, the fire, oh, my dear girl, my dear, dear girl." "I thought you were gone too," Martha sobbed. "I've been so lost without you, Mother Sophia, so lost." They drew apart slightly, though their hands remained clasped. Sophia touched Martha's face gently, as if confirming she was real. "Let me look at you," she breathed. "Oh, you've grown so. But your eyes, still the same eyes that used to watch me teach letters." The spell that held the crowd broke gradually. Whispers began to circulate, and Elijah caught fragments of conversation as people tried to make sense of what they'd witnessed. He ignored them, moving instead to gather Sophia's dropped gloves from the snow. The driver was removing Martha's trunk from the coach, looking confused about where to put it. Elijah stepped forward. "It'll go in my sled," he said quietly. The driver nodded, seemingly relieved to have direction. Sophia and Martha remained lost in their own world, speaking in soft, broken sentences. "But how did you survive? Where did you go?" "I searched everywhere." Their words tumbled over each other, years of separation and grief trying to bridge themselves in moments. Elijah approached them carefully, not wanting to intrude but knowing they couldn't stand in the street forever. "We should get you both home," he said gently. "It's cold out here." Sophia turned to him, with tears still streaming down her face, but her smile was radiant. "Elijah," she said, "this is Martha. My Martha from the mission. The one I told you about." Her voice caught. "The one I thought I'd lost." Martha looked at him with uncertain eyes, and Elijah saw fear flicker across her face. He understood. She'd come expecting to meet a stranger who'd bid for her as a bride, and now everything had changed in ways none of them could have predicted. "You're safe," he said simply. "Both of you. Let's get you home where it's warm, and you can talk properly." He helped them both into the sled, noting how they kept hold of each other's hands, as if afraid to let go. The trunk was secured, and Elijah took up the reins. As they pulled away from the depot, he heard the buzz of conversation rise behind them, knew that by nightfall the story would be all over town. The horses' hooves beat a steady rhythm against the snow as they made their way back to the cabin. Sophia and Martha spoke softly in the back of the sled. Their words meant only for each other. Elijah caught fragments, tales of narrow escape, of separation, of years searching. His heart ached for what they'd endured. At one point, Sophia's voice carried forward clearly. "The Lord remembers his lost children," she said haltingly. "Even when we think ourselves forgotten, he remembers." Elijah lifted his eyes to the winter sky, bright and clear above the snow-covered peaks. He thought about providence and timing, about an error in paperwork that had brought Sophia to his door just days before Martha's arrival. His hands tightened on the reins as something like awe settled over him. The cabin came into view, smoke still rising straight from the chimney where they'd left the fire banked that morning. Martha gasped softly at the sight, perhaps at its isolation, or perhaps at its promise of shelter. Sophia squeezed her hand reassuringly. As Elijah drew the sled to a halt, he realized that everything had changed in the space of a morning. The quiet life he'd known, first in solitude and then in Sophia's gentle company, would never be quite the same. But watching Sophia help Martha down from the sled, seeing the love and joy that radiated from both their faces, he found he didn't mind the change at all. He lifted Martha's trunk from the sled, reasoning that whatever came next, they would face it together. Sometimes, he reflected, the Lord's methods of answering prayers were more mysterious and wonderful than anyone could imagine. The sound of their boots on the porch steps echoed in the clear mountain air. Sophia opened the cabin door, still holding Martha's hand, and warmth spilled out to meet them. They crossed the threshold together, stepping into whatever future God had planned for this most unexpected family. The cabin door creaked shut behind them, sealing out the winter chill. Martha stood just inside the threshold, her traveling dress dusted with snow, taking in the simple interior with wide eyes. The main room glowed with welcoming warmth from the fireplace, where flames danced over well-seasoned logs. "Come, come," Sophia urged, already unwrapping Martha's scarf with motherly concern. "You must be frozen through from that long stage ride. Let's get you by the fire." Martha allowed herself to be guided to the rocking chair nearest the hearth, her movements tentative, as if she couldn't quite believe where she was. Elijah hung back, watching as Sophia fussed over the girl, tucking a quilt around her shoulders and pressing a tin cup of hot coffee into her cold hands. "There now," Sophia murmured, smoothing Martha's hair back from her face. "You're safe here, dear one. Safe and warm." The girl's hands trembled slightly around the cup, and Elijah noticed tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She looked exhausted, shadows beneath her eyes speaking of sleepless nights and long worry. But there was something else there, too, a fragile hope beginning to bloom as she watched Sophia move about the cabin with familiar efficiency. Sophia bustled to the kitchen area, pulling out pans and provisions. "You must be hungry after your journey. I'll fix us all a proper supper. Some hot biscuits, maybe, and that venison stew I put on this morning." "I can help," Martha offered, starting to rise, but Sophia gently pressed her back into the chair. "You'll do no such thing. You rest there and get warm. There'll be plenty of time for helping later." Elijah cleared his throat, drawing both women's attention. He'd been standing quietly by the door, feeling somewhat out of place in this reunion, but knowing he needed to speak. "There's plenty of room here," he said gruffly, "for all three of us, if that's what you want." Sophia paused in her preparation, turning to look at him with grateful eyes. Martha glanced. Between them, uncertainty clear on her face. "But I thought," she began hesitantly, "the mission board said I was to be—" She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. "That don't matter now," Elijah said firmly. "What matters is you're here, and you're Sophia's girl, and there's room enough." The relief that flooded Martha's face made her look even younger. She ducked her head, hiding behind her cup, but Elijah saw her shoulders relax slightly under the quilt. The cabin filled with comfortable sounds as Sophia prepared their meal, the clatter of pans, the soft thump of dough being kneaded, the snap and pop of the fire. The familiar scents of baking bread and simmering stew gradually replaced the chill mountain air that had followed them inside. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin's windows, they gathered around the table. Steam rose from their bowls, and fresh biscuits sat golden brown in a cloth-lined basket. Sophia bowed her head to say grace, her voice thick with emotion as she thanked the Lord for bringing them together. Over supper, Martha's story emerged in quiet pieces between bites of stew and careful sips of coffee. She spoke of the confusion after the mission fire, how another family had found her wandering and taken her in. Her voice grew softer as she described the fever that had swept through their small settlement 2 years later, claiming her adoptive parents, along with so many others. "The mission board," Martha's spoon stirred listlessly in her bowl. "They said I was too old for another placement. That marriage was the best option for a girl my age. I didn't know what else to do." Sophia wiped tears from her cheeks with trembling fingers. "Oh, my dear one, if I'd only known you were alive." "I wrote letters," Martha whispered, "to the old mission address. They all came back unopened." Elijah watched as Sophia reached across the table to clasp Martha's hand. The girl's fingers curled around her former teachers like a lifeline. He thought about the lonely years they'd both endured, searching for each other across the vast expanse of the frontier, and felt something in his own heart shift and soften. After the dishes were cleared and washed, Sophia helped Martha settle into the small bedroom that had stood empty since Elijah's wife passed. He'd offered it without hesitation, knowing it was right. The two women spoke in soft voices as they made up the bed with fresh linens, their words indistinct, but comforting in their familiar cadence. Night settled fully over the cabin, bringing with it a gentle snowfall that whispered against the windows. Elijah banked the fire for the night, while Sophia arranged her own bedding near Martha's door, unwilling to be far from the girl she'd thought lost forever. In the darkness, Elijah lay on his pallet in the main room, listening to the murmured prayers that drifted from the bedroom. Two voices joined in familiar verses, Sophia's steady and sure, Martha's hesitant, but growing stronger. Their words blended with the soft fall of snow outside, creating a melody of peace that filled the cabin's every corner. He realized, lying there in the gentle dark, how different the cabin felt now. Where once silence had pressed against him like a physical weight, now the space hummed with life. The quiet breathing of others, the creak of floorboards under careful steps, the rustle of blankets, all spoke of home in a way he'd almost forgotten. Through the window, he could see snowflakes drifting down in the moonlight, adding another layer to the white blanket that already covered the yard. The soft accumulation seemed to seal them away from the outside world, creating a peaceful cocoon around their newfound family. Martha's voice rose slightly in a final "Amen," followed by Sophia's deeper echo. Then came the sounds of settling, blankets being tucked, quiet goodnights exchanged, the gentle creak of the rocking chair as Sophia presumably watched over Martha's drift into sleep. Elijah closed his eyes, feeling the rhythm of the cabin's breathing change as its occupants found their rest. The silence that fell now was different from the hollow quiet he'd known for so many years. This was the silence of peace, of safety found, of hope restored. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a whispered blessing on the sanctuary they'd found in each other. A week after Martha's arrival, the mountain air softened with the first hints of thaw. Icicles dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves, and patches of brown earth began showing through the thinning snow. The change in weather seemed to lift everyone's spirits, drawing them outdoors into the weak but warming sunlight. Elijah stood in the muddy yard, holding the lead rope of his old mule, Jefferson. Martha watched with keen interest as he demonstrated how to properly fit the harness. "Mind his ears now," he instructed, showing her how to slip the headstall on without pinching. "Jefferson here's got gentle ways, but every mule deserves respect." Martha nodded seriously, her eyes following his movements. She reached out tentatively to pat Jefferson's broad neck, and the mule turned his head to snuffle at her sleeve, making her giggle. "He's nothing like those fancy carriage horses back east," she observed, growing bolder as Jefferson continued his gentle inspection of her pockets for treats. "No, he ain't," Elijah agreed, a hint of pride in his voice. "But he's sure-footed in the mountains and strong as any two horses put together. Here now, you try the harness." From her seat on the front porch, Sophia looked up from her mending to watch them. The sight of Elijah's patient instruction and Martha's eager learning brought a warm smile to her face. Her needle moved steadily through the fabric of one of Elijah's worn shirts as she observed their interaction. "Easy does it," Elijah was saying, guiding Martha's hands. "Just slip it right over. There you have it." Martha beamed with accomplishment as she successfully fastened the last buckle. Jefferson stood placidly, seemingly amused by the girl's enthusiasm. "Can I lead him around the yard?" Martha asked hopefully. "Reckon that'd be fine," Elijah nodded. "Just remember what I showed you about the commands." Sophia's heart swelled as she watched Martha confidently guide the mule in a circle, her voice clear and firm as she used the commands Elijah had taught her. The girl who had arrived scared and uncertain just a week ago was already showing signs of settling into their strange little family. "She's a natural with animals," Sophia commented as Elijah climbed the porch steps to join her. "That she is," he agreed, lowering himself onto the rough-hewn bench beside her. "Reminds me of someone else I know who's got a way of gentling creatures." His eyes met hers briefly before looking away, and Sophia felt her cheeks warm slightly. She focused on her stitching, trying to hide her pleased smile. Laughter rang out across the yard as Jefferson playfully tried to investigate Martha's pockets again. The sound echoed off the mountainside, bright and clear in the crisp air. "I never thought I'd hear such joy here again," Elijah said quietly, almost to himself. Sophia's hands stilled in her lap. She had been thinking about this moment all morning, trying to find the right words. "Elijah, I've been meaning to speak with you about something." He turned to look at her, his expression questioning. "I've been thinking of looking for work in town," she said carefully. Perhaps the school needs help, or the general store. I don't want to be a burden on your household any longer than necessary." Elijah's brow furrowed deeply. A burden? The word seemed to taste bitter in his mouth. "This is your home now, Sophia." She looked away, unable to meet his intense gaze. "That's very kind of you, but I know this isn't what you expected when you made that bid at the auction. You've already done more than enough, taking in both Martha and me." "Kind has nothing to do with it," he said gruffly. "This cabin, it wasn't really a home until you came. Just 4 walls and too much quiet." Before Sophia could respond, Martha's voice called out from the yard. "Mr. Holt, look how well Jefferson minds me." They both turned to watch as Martha guided the mule through a series of careful turns, her face glowing with pride. The afternoon sun caught in her dark hair, making it shine like polished copper. "Well done," Sophia called out encouragingly, though her heart still felt unsettled from the conversation. Later that afternoon, Elijah worked at the chopping block, splitting logs for the evening fire. The steady rhythm of his axe helped order his thoughts, but couldn't fully quiet the turmoil in his mind. The idea of Sophia leaving twisted something deep in his chest. He paused, leaning on the axe handle, and watched as she moved about inside the cabin, visible through the window. Her presence had changed everything, the way the cabin felt, the way he felt. The thought of returning to the emptiness of before was unbearable. He knew he wanted her to stay forever, knew it as surely as he knew the changing of seasons. But the words stuck in his throat every time he tried to speak them. Pride, fear, or maybe both kept him silent. What could he offer a woman like Sophia? His rough cabin, his scarred heart? The axe bit deep into another log as he wrestled with his thoughts. The sound of splitting wood echoed off the mountainside like gunshots. Inside, Sophia and Martha worked together preparing supper, their movements already familiar and comfortable with each other. The scent of baking cornbread drifted out to where he worked, along with the sound of their quiet conversation and occasional laughter. When Elijah finally carried an armload of split wood inside, the cabin was warm and bright with lamplight. The table was set, steam rising from bowls of beans and salt pork. Martha was just pulling the golden cornbread from the oven, while Sophia poured coffee into tin cups. "Just in time," Sophia smiled at him. "Wash up now, everything's ready." They settled around the table, and Sophia said grace as she did every evening, her voice soft but steady, as she thanked the Lord for their blessings. Elijah found himself watching her hands as she spoke. Capable hands, marked with the occasional scar or burn from years of work, but gentle in their every movement. The meal began quietly, but soon Martha started telling them about her adventures with Jefferson that afternoon. Her enthusiasm was infectious, drawing smiles from both adults. "You know," Martha said suddenly, looking between Elijah and Sophia with a mischievous glint in her eye, "you two remind me of the old sweethearts who used to visit the mission, the ones who'd been married so long they couldn't see straight anymore but still made eyes at each other across the room." Sophia nearly choked on her coffee, color flooding her cheeks. Elijah felt his own face grow warm as he stared determinedly at his plate. "Martha Bell," Sophia managed to say, though her voice wasn't quite steady. "That's hardly appropriate dinner conversation." But Martha just grinned, clearly pleased with the reaction she'd provoked. "I'm just saying what I see," she said innocently, breaking off another piece of cornbread. The rest of the meal passed in slightly flustered silence, broken only by requests to pass the coffee pot or the last of the cornbread. Yet something had shifted in the air between them, making both Elijah and Sophia hyper-aware of each accidental brush of hands or meeting of eyes. After supper, Martha helped clear the dishes while humming a hymn under her breath. Elijah stepped out onto the porch for his evening smoke, his thoughts as tangled as the smoke that curled up toward the stars. Inside, he could hear Sophia teaching Martha a new stitch as they sat by the fire, their voices a soft murmur through the cabin wall. The night air was cool, but no longer bitter with winter's bite. Spring was coming to the mountains, slow but sure. As he stood there in the gathering darkness, Elijah realized that his heart, too, was thawing after its long winter, whether he was ready for it or not. The creak of the cabin door made him turn. Sophia stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the warm light from inside. "Martha's turning in for the night," she said softly. "I've just got a few more stitches to put in your shirt before bed." Elijah nodded, unable to find words as she lingered there, caught between lamplight and starlight. Finally, she stepped back inside, closing the door quietly behind her. He remained on the porch a while longer, listening to the night sounds of the mountains and the faint movements from within the cabin. The simple domestic noises that had become so precious to him. The scrape of a chair, the clink of dishes being put away, the soft creak of floorboards under familiar feet. When he finally went inside, Sophia sat in her usual spot by the fire, his mended shirt folded neatly in her lap. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment their eyes met in the soft lamplight. All the words he couldn't say seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. But pride and uncertainty still held his tongue, and the moment passed. They bid each other good night quietly, each retreating to their separate corners of the cabin, while Martha's earlier words echoed in their minds. Outside, the last patches of snow continued to melt under the starlight, making way for spring's tentative arrival. Inside, two hearts struggled with their own kind of thawing, each afraid to hope too much, to trust too deeply, yet unable to deny the warmth growing between them. The night wrapped the cabin in darkness, broken only by dying embers in the hearth. A sudden scream shattered the quiet, making Elijah bolt upright in his bed. Martha's voice, raw with terror, echoed through the cabin walls. "No, the fire! Please, help them!" Sophia was already moving, her nightgown a pale shape in the darkness as she hurried to Martha's corner. Elijah lit a lamp with trembling hands, casting a warm glow across the room. In its light, he saw Martha thrashing beneath her quilt, tears streaming down her face even in sleep. "Hush now, dear one," Sophia murmured, gathering the girl into her arms. "You're safe. The fire's long gone." Martha's eyes flew open, wild and unseeing at first. Then recognition dawned, and she collapsed against Sophia's shoulder, sobbing. "I saw them burning again. My family, both families. Everyone I love burns away." Elijah stood helplessly by his bed, watching Sophia rock Martha like a child. His hands clenched at his sides, useless against these ghosts of grief. He knew too well how memories could haunt the night hours. "I'll make some tea," he said gruffly, needing to do something. As he stoked the fire and set water to boil, Sophia's gentle voice continued its comfort. "The Lord keeps watch, Martha, even in our darkest hours." By the time the tea was ready, Martha's sobs had quieted to hiccups. Elijah handed them each a steaming cup, then retreated to give them space. But he couldn't help overhearing their whispered conversation. "I'm sorry," Martha said. "I'm nothing but trouble, a burden." "Never that," Sophia insisted. "You're my girl." "But I'm grown now, and I keep bringing my darkness into your lives." Dawn found Martha already dressed and packing her few belongings into a cloth sack. Elijah intercepted her at the door. "Where do you think you're heading?" he demanded. "Denver," she replied, chin lifted in defiance. "I can find work there. Make my own way." It's too dangerous, Elijah growled. The spring trails are treacherous. Bandits watch the roads. I'm not a child anymore, Martha's voice rose. I've survived worse than mud and thieves. That's not the point. Then what is? She whirled on him. I won't wait for tragedy to find me here. Won't watch it take another family from me. Sophia appeared in the doorway, face drawn with worry. Martha, please, think about this. I have thought. All night. Martha's voice softened. You've both been so kind, but I need to stand on my own feet now. Elijah stepped forward, anger masking his fear. You're being foolish, reckless. And you're being suffocating, Martha shot back. I'm not some delicate flower that needs protecting. I'm a woman grown, with my own choices to make. Before either Elijah or Sophia could respond, Martha pushed past them into the pale morning light. They followed her to the barn, where she began efficiently saddling Jefferson. At least wait until proper daylight, Elijah pleaded, his anger crumbling into desperation. But Martha's hands never slowed in their work. She secured her pack, checked the cinch, and swung into the saddle with practiced ease. Looking down at them, her face softened slightly. Thank you both, for everything, but I need to do this. Sophia reached up to squeeze her hand. Be careful, my dear one. Remember, you always have a home here. Martha nodded, tears brightening her eyes. Then she turned Jefferson toward the trail and urged him forward. Elijah and Sophia stood side by side, watching helplessly as she disappeared into the misty dawn. The sound of hoofbeats faded slowly into silence. Sophia's hand found Elijah's arm, gripping it tightly. Neither spoke, their eyes fixed on the empty trail where Martha had vanished, carrying their hearts with her into the dangerous unknown. By midday, heavy snowflakes began swirling from slate-gray skies. Elijah's jaw tightened as he saddled his horse, checking the cinch with practiced hands. The thought of Martha alone in this weather gnawed at his conscience like a hungry wolf. Back in the cabin, Sophia paced before the crackling hearth. Her trembling fingers held her worn Bible as she read aloud, her voice steady despite her fear. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Hours crept by as Elijah followed the increasingly faint hoofprints through the whispering pines. The cold bit through his heavy coat, numbing his fingers on the reins. Jefferson's tracks meandered, showing Martha's uncertainty about the trail. When dusk painted the snow in purple shadows, Sophia knelt by the cabin door. Her silver head bowed as she whispered, Bring them home, Lord. Keep them safe in your hands. The night deepened, dark and bitter. Elijah's horse picked its way carefully along a ridge until he spotted a hunched figure near the creek below. Martha sat huddled against a boulder, arms wrapped around herself. Relief flooded through him, until the ice beneath his horse's hooves gave a sickening crack. The world tilted as the frozen creek bed splintered, plunging both rider and mount into the deadly cold water below. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. Sophia stood at the cabin door, her heart heavy with worry. No sign of Elijah or Martha since yesterday. The empty silence pressed against her ears like a physical weight. With trembling fingers, she pulled on her boots and wrapped Elijah's spare coat around her shoulders. The familiar scent of leather and pine brought tears to her eyes. She tucked her small Bible into the pocket and grabbed the old brass lantern. Lord, guide my steps, she whispered, stepping into the biting cold. Her breath wheezed in the thin mountain air as she followed the faint tracks leading toward the creek. The wind cut through her like knives, but she refused to turn back. Near the creek bed, she spotted them, two dark shapes half buried in snow. Elijah lay curled around Martha, his own coat wrapped protectively around the girl. Both were still as death. Sophia fell to her knees beside them, her cracked lips moving in desperate prayer. Heavenly Father, breathe your life into them. She scooped handfuls of snow, melting it between her palms to moisten their lips. As she worked, she recited psalms in a voice that grew stronger with each verse. The Lord is my light and my salvation, she sang into the howling wind, watching their eyes flutter open. 3 days passed like a dream. The mountain winds gentled, and healing settled over the cabin like a warm blanket. On the 4th morning, Elijah stirred beneath his quilts, drawn to consciousness by the rich aroma of rabbit stew simmering on the hearth. His eyes opened to find Sophia perched in the rocking chair beside him, her knitting needles clicking softly in the firelight. The worry lines around her eyes had softened into smile creases, and relief brightened her gaze as she noticed him watching. Across the room, Martha slept peacefully on her pallet, her dark hair spread across the pillow. Weak but filled with gratitude, Elijah reached out and clasped Sophia's weathered hand in his. The touch felt right, like coming home after a long journey. I bid for a bride, he whispered, voice rough with emotion, but the Lord sent me a teacher instead. Sophia's eyes welled with tears as she smiled down at him. Her fingers tightened around his. Would you stay? He asked softly. Long as the snow falls, and maybe forever? From her pallet, Martha stirred and murmured sleepily, That's a fine idea, Pa. Their quiet laughter mingled with the whisper of wind outside, 3 hearts finding home in each other at last. The mountain winter loosened its grip gradually, like fingers uncurling from a long-held fist. Patches of earth emerged from beneath the snow, dark and rich with possibility. As March drew to a close, the land awakened to the whispered promise of spring. Elijah stood in what would become their garden, studying the softening ground. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard while he worked the soil with his hoe, each strike breaking up the winter-hardened earth. Beside him, Sophia knelt in her faded blue dress, carefully marking rows with twine. Martha moved between them, her basket filled with seed packets from the general store. The soil feels ready, Sophia said, running her fingers through the dark loam. The Lord's timing is perfect, as always. Elijah paused in his work, watching her. The morning light caught the silver in her hair, making it shine like mountain streams. Reckon he knows what he's about, he agreed softly. Martha scattered carrot seeds along the first row, her movements precise and careful. Mother Sophia taught me about planting back at the mission, she explained. We had a little garden there before. Her voice trailed off, but the shadow in her eyes passed quickly. Sophia reached over to squeeze the girl's hand. And now we'll make new memories in this one, dear heart. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Through the melting snow came Preacher Davidson, his horse picking its way carefully along the muddy trail. He carried a small wooden box in his hands, and his face bore a knowing smile. Beautiful morning for planting, he called out as he dismounted, and perhaps for other new beginnings as well. Elijah set down his hoe, wiping his palms against his trousers. The preacher approached and held out the box. Found this at the silversmith's in Denver last week. Thought you might be wanting it. Inside, nestled in a scrap of velvet, lay Sarah's wedding band, Elijah's first wife's ring. The gold gleamed softly, polished to new brightness, sized smaller now to fit Sophia's finger. Elijah's throat tightened at the sight. Sarah would have wanted this, the preacher said gently. Love isn't diminished by being shared again, Brother Holt. It multiplies. Sophia stood very still, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Martha moved closer, slipping an arm around her mother's waist. Well then, Preacher Davidson smiled. Shall we make this official?" They gathered in a small circle there in the garden, surrounded by newly turned earth. "And promise." The preacher opened his Bible, its pages ruffling in the spring breeze. Martha stood witness, clutching her seed basket like a bouquet. Elijah took Sophia's hands in his. They were strong hands, marked by years of work and caring for others. Beautiful hands. His voice was rough with emotion as he repeated the ancient vows. "I, Elijah, take thee, Sophia." The words rose like prayer into the melting sky. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, a shaft of sunlight struck the gold, setting it ablaze with glory. Sophia looked upward, her lips moving in silent thanksgiving. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," the preacher proclaimed. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Their kiss was gentle, blessed by Martha's happy tears and the preacher's beaming approval. After sharing a simple meal of bread and preserves, the preacher rode away, leaving the new family to their joy. That evening, lamplight pooled golden in the cabin windows. The smell of fresh-baked cornbread filled the air as they sat down to their first supper as a proper family. Martha had decorated the table with early spring wildflowers she'd found along the creek. Sophia's ring caught the light as she passed the butter, and Elijah found himself marveling at how right it looked on her hand, how right everything felt at last. "Turns out the Lord did send me a virgin bride after all," he said softly. "Pure of heart, tried by fire." Sophia's eyes met his across the table, full of understanding and love. "And you," she answered, "a husband reborn." Martha's smile brightened the room as she reached for both their hands. Together they bowed their heads in gratitude, 3 lives redeemed by faith, bound now by love, sheltered in the grace of home restored. The cabin glowed with warmth and laughter long into the evening, while outside the last snow melted into spring, and high above, stars wheeled in their ancient dance, bearing witness to God's providence made manifest in 3 hearts, beating as one. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.